Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday School series on the topic of Christianity and technology. Again, this morning we have a guest lecturer, Dr. Calvin Beisner of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. This is his third lesson with us here at River Oaks, and I just want to give you a heads up on what to expect. Dr. Beisner is going to be out of town for the next couple of weeks, and so we will shift to a new topic with our teacher, Art Hunt. I don't know if Art is in the classroom at the moment. I don't think I see him. But he'll be talking about the topic of entertainment. So if you've heard names like Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman, we're going to be learning about those sources over the next couple weeks. And then Cal is going to come back on July 7th to teach his fourth and final lesson on the topic of environmental stewardship. So also don't forget that if you have missed any of our previous classes, we are recording them and we are uploading them to our YouTube channel. So if you do a YouTube search for River Oaks Academy, that's River Oaks one word, you'll be able to find these lessons uploaded and available for you. All right, I think that's all the announcements I have. So with all that said, I'll hand it over to Cal.
All right, thank you very much. I'm just going to first quickly refer to these two things that you would have found on a chair near you or under you or on a table in front of you. This gives you information about a podcast that the Cornwall Alliance produces called Created to Reign. I hope that you will all get some fun out of that. Often we do have fun with it. David Legates particularly is good at including humor in his teaching. And then this, modus operandi, how the EPA and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, that's a long name, right? Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, keep your fears alive. This is by Frank Schnell, who was a leading scientist with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease for quite a long time, a veteran. And he basically reveals the pretty, frankly, dishonest ways in which both the EPA and the ATS, whatever, how they basically cook the numbers on lots of different things in order to make people fearful. So I want to make sure that everybody gets one of these, so please be sure to take one with you. Schnell's booklet, of course, is a pretty short read, which is handy. So I'll start with that. And now I want to do a quick reference back to last week. I told you last week that Adam Smith embraced the utility theory, or the marginal utility theory of value. Kyle talked with me afterward, and he said, hey, I read Sean Rittenauer's Intro to Economics. Sean is a professor at Grove City College and a friend of mine. He's actually on Cornwall Alliance's list of affiliated scholars. And he said, Sean says that Adam Smith actually did embrace the labor theory of value. And I thought, gee, did I mess up there? So I thought, I wonder if there's something a little more nuanced in here. So I spent about a day this week going through all of that and reading various articles on it and so on. And I reread the key chapters in Smith's Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations on value and price. And it was very interesting to me to do that. And here's the conclusion to which I came, basically, that Smith argued that in a super primitive society where there was no money, no medium of exchange, right? And where there were no tools whatsoever, all you had for, getting the food you needed, which was about all you tried for, was your own bodily strength, right? In that circumstance, the value of anything to you was measured by the labor you were willing to put into acquiring that. The energy of lifting your hand to pull a peach off a tree, okay, or whatever of that sort. In that circumstance, labor was the fundamental definer of value. But as soon as you began to have tools and money as a medium of exchange, then labor got mixed with capital, which is the tools, but what underlay both your willingness to do that labor in the first place and the willingness to make tools in order to enhance your labor was the satisfaction that you expected to receive from the acquisition that you went after. And so for Smith, utility theory and labor and capital all mixed together, and what really lay at the very bottom of everything was the utility, the use that you expected to receive from something. Now, Smith didn't follow that out very much in his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Later generations of economists did, and particularly the group called the classical economists, especially those who embraced marginal utility theory, tended to oversimplify Smith and then contrast their own view with his. I actually think Smith's was quite good. Anyway, didn't want to leave you, even though it's a technical point, I didn't want to leave you misled as to Smith's thinking, all right? So now, let's see. We are, here's a bit of a caveat for the entire lesson, and frankly, it could be for the entire series. H.L. Mencken, a journalist, very quotable fellow, and he was an anti-Christian, frankly, but he got it right here. Says the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. And somebody walked up to me a little bit ago and said something about, all the various different predictions of environmental catastrophe that have come and gone without the catastrophes ever coming and going are indicators of how right Mencken was. So when we get into today's subject, which is basically population and resources and environmental quality, pollution, that sort of thing, we need to keep this in mind because frankly an awful lot of the fears are built on hobgoblins. And so far in my life I have never encountered a real hobgoblin. They're all mythical. Okay, now I also want to recommend some readings to you. And because frankly today's topic is way, way, way too big. When I talked with Kyle about it, I was not realizing just how big it would go. But I would hope that some of you would really want to learn a good deal more about these things. The first 3 books up on top there are by me, Prospects for Growth, A Biblical View of Population Resources in the Future. Starts out with some basic principles of biblical ethics and economics, and then builds from those into understanding why fears of overpopulation are unfounded. And then from there we go into quality of life issues. Well, gee whiz, maybe we have a whole lot of us, but life is pretty bad because with so many of us we can't have adequate housing and adequate food and so on. No, I show that all of the long-term trends are the exact opposite of that. The more of us there are, the more productive we are. One of my mentors was Julian Simon, who is the author, the author of The Ultimate Resource 2 here. He's the general editor, the editor-in-chief of the book, The State of Humanity, which is really quite an amazing work. Julian hired me to be the managing editor for that. We had 58 chapters by 60 different authors, including 8 Nobel Prize-winning economists. Julian Simon used to say, look, the more people you have, the more productive they become because of 2 things. One, they can specialize more and more. If you live all alone out in the wilderness, you have to do everything, right? If you're in a town, You can trade your products for the products of other people so you can specialize more. If you're in a densely populated city, man, your specialty can be tiny. And yet, there's demand for that allows you to earn far more than you need to consume, and you can trade more with others. So that's part of it. The other part is that technological improvement over time enables improvements in the product of labor, the productivity of labor, and technological improvements happen by the sharing of ideas, information. And the more people you have involved, the more you share ideas and build off of each other's ideas, and that brings about increasingly rapid technological growth. So my basic argument is that human beings, as God made us to be, are capable of just some really tremendous achievements. And the history of humanity is full of that. Where garden meets wilderness, evangelical entry into the environmental debate is my sort of survey of the history of evangelical writing in this field from the 1960s through the early 1990s. This was published in 97, and I'd love to do a complete rewrite of it sometime if I can get the time. But I intend it to be a constructive critique of the movement. It deals with the movement's use of scripture, its use of economics, its use of science, its empirical claims, various things. And there are plenty of very good things, but frankly, if that's all there was, I wouldn't have needed to write a different book. So I focus on what are the areas where really there needs to be improvement. And one fellow whose work I critiqued somewhat in this book came to me one time at a conference, and he really thanked me for it. He said this was really wonderful. It helped him a whole lot. Another fellow gave me the Toxic Turkey Award. So it depends on how people think. The Skeptical Environmentalist is by Bjørn Lomborg. He's a Danish statistician and economist. He was a dyed-in-the-wool radical environmentalist for quite a while. And in the mid-1990s, he encountered Julian Simon's ideas, and he was outraged at what an idiot Simon was about environmental quality issues. And he said, I'm a statistician. Simon depends on all these long-term statistics. I can refute everything he's done. So he set out to do so. And instead, he got totally persuaded. And he came out and wrote this book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, in which he not only affirms everything that Simon was saying, but he even goes beyond a lot of what Simon said. He's a brilliant man, a controversial man. He heads the Copenhagen Consensus Center that involves the work of, I believe they have 7 different Nobel Prize winners involved with them. And they put out various reports from time to time. And the fundamental question they're always asking is, granted that life is full of trade-offs, where do we get the most bang for the buck? That is, if we're going to spend $1 billion here versus here, which one will yield more improvement to human well-being? And they do that over and over again. Every few years they come out with an update of the report, and it's quite fascinating stuff. Then the next book here is The Improving State of the World, Why We're Living Longer, Healthier, More Comfortable Lives on a Cleaner Planet, by Inder Gotlani. Gotlani is an economist with the US Department of Interior. And he just simply gives you the long-term data on all of these different things. The final one is by Michael Schellenberger. Schellenberger is a longtime environmentalist. Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. And he just goes through the various different predictions of environmental catastrophe and shows that they haven't happened and why they haven't happened. He's a brilliant man. So, let's see. Now we will move to fears of overpopulation. Now, I want to ask you, who said this and when did he say it? What most frequently meets our view and occasions complaint is our teeming population. Our numbers are burdensome to the world, which can hardly supply us from its natural elements. Our wants grow more and more keen, and our complaints more bitter in all mouths, whilst nature fails in affording us her usual sustenance. In very deed, pestilence and famine and wars and earthquakes have to be regarded as a remedy for nations, as the means of pruning the luxuriance of the human race. Now, who said that and when? Anybody want to volunteer a guess? Was it Malthus? That is the overwhelming majority guess. Well, no. It's actually Tertullian, the founder of Latin theology. He wrote this in his essay, his treatise on the soul, that he wrote around about AD 200. The best estimate of world population at that time was that it was around 190 to 250 million people for the entire world. That's about 1/40th of what it is today. And he had that fear. Now, I could go farther back. I could go back to Abraham and Lot, right? Why did they separate? Because they were afraid that the land couldn't support both of their families or tribes, whatever you would call them at that stage, right? They didn't think that the land could produce enough to support them. So they separated. Notice what Lot did. Lot looked around and he saw, oh, goodness, here are the green valleys over here. This is really lush. He chose that. Abraham had said to him, pick whichever you want, I'll take the other. Abraham acted by faith. Lot by fear. Whom did God bless? He blessed Abraham, right? And at the time, the total population of Canaan was probably not more than, a few 100,000. And today in Israel, I don't remember the population of Israel, but it's several millions. And then there are the others in Lebanon and Syria and elsewhere in that same area. That land is not supporting those people. It never did. People support people, transforming raw materials into resources. So, fears of overpopulation are very old, and they are most often connected to Thomas Robert Malthus, who was a Presbyterian minister as well as an economist. And his essay on the principle of population was first published in 1798. Here are just a couple of quotes from him. Population, when unchecked, goes on doubling itself every 25 years or increases in a geometrical ratio. Now, if that were actually true, current world population would be pushing 512 billion people. Instead, it's around 8, right? So clearly there's a problem right there already. He also added, the superior power of population cannot be checked without producing misery or vice. And so he prescribed birth control as a substitute for war, famine, and pestilence to limit population. Now, his thinking influenced a later thinker with whom I'm sure you're all familiar, and that was Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin took Malthus's concept about a competition for these very limited resources that could not grow as rapidly as population, and he applied that to his question of how the various species came about. And that, of course, led to his book. I always mess up the title, so I got it right here. Should have put this in the PPT, but on the origin of species, we all just hear the origin of species, just like the wealth of nations. No, the real critical thing about the title is in those other words that are left out, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Well, here, the words are left out. on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Now, racism has a very long history in human civilization, but this was a clear scientific basis for it. And if you see various races as competing with you for limited resources that cannot be made to be sufficient for everybody, then you want to have some races not compete well and others repeat well. This gave rise, in the work of Darwin's cousin Francis Galton, who in 1883 published a book called Inquiries into Human Faculty and Development, where he coined the term eugenics, the search for ways to ensure that only the best genes get passed on, and the worst are weeded out. That launched the eugenics movement, which was embraced in the late 19th and early 20th century by Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood here in America. It was also embraced by Adolf Hitler, who praised Sanger's ideas, and Sanger actually met with Hitler. The eugenics movement was very popular throughout America and Britain for a long time. One Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, wrote something in defense of a federal forced sterilization program that I think it was 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So the federal government was forcing the sterilization of people deemed mentally incompetent one way or another. It's not an accident that Margaret Sanger's birth control facilities were all located in black neighborhoods, because she considered, based on Darwin and Galton, blacks to be racially inferior, and therefore we needed to quell their growth while stimulating the growth of the most advanced race, the white Anglo-Saxons. That's the eugenics movement. Now, here are a few juicy quotes for you from some neo-Malthusians. Bertrand Russell, in 1953, said, "At present, the population of the world is increasing at about 58,000 per diem. War, so that's per day, war so far has had no very great effect on this increase. War has hitherto been disappointing. If a Black Death could spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. The state of affairs might be somewhat unpleasant, but what of it?" Oh, isn't that a friendly idea, right? Or Rockefeller Foundation official Merton Lambert in 1962 says, "The world has cancer, and that cancer cell is man." From the Christian perspective, I would say, we're not cancer, we're the answer, right? And Kingsley Davis, writing in California Medicine, a journal in 1970, said, "In subsequent history, the 20th century may be called either the century of world wars or the century of the population plague." Imagine that kind of a way of thinking of human beings as a plague. Also, we have in David Foreman, the founder of Earth First. He was also on the board of the Sierra Club for many, many years, before and after he started Earth First. He said, "We advocate biodiversity for biodiversity's sake. It may take our extinction to set things straight." He added, "Phasing out the human race will solve every problem on Earth, social and environmental." And then, of course, there's Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II, who was on the board of the World Wildlife Fund, one of its major funders. And he said, "If I were reincarnated, I would wish to be returned to Earth as a killer virus to lower human population levels." That's the mentality that lies behind a great deal of the environmental and particularly population growth movements, and they are deeply intertwined with each other. But Malthus is actually undone, and he's even undone by Malthus himself. Malthus also wrote, "The main peculiarity which distinguishes man from other animals is the means of his support, with the power which he possesses of very greatly increasing these means." Now, why is that? It's because human beings made in God's image are not merely consumers, but also producers and stewards. They are capable of multiplying their resources faster than their population. Hunting and gathering can support no more than 1 or 2 people per square mile in the best of habitats. Instead, right now, average population density for the globe as a whole, land area only, and not including Antarctica, is, if I remember correctly, around 255 people per square mile. That's because we produce so much more than we absolutely have to have in order to stay alive. Quick question?
The aphorism is, we have one mouth but 2 hands.
Yes, and not just 2 hands, but also a mind. So that let's see, who was the great theoretical physicist who died recently in Britain, totally paralyzed? Stephen Hawking, thank you. Stephen Hawking couldn't use his hands at all, but he still made tremendous contributions. We have 2 hands and a mind, and those things make us amazingly productive. Malthus, by the way, published his essay on the principle of population in 1798. John Stuart Mill critiqued him and pointed out that what was buried in this one sentence here that I've just quoted for you was actually the root of the refutation of his entire theory. Mill pointed out that people do tend to produce far more than they consume, and that they do so as they're able to trade, and that as population rises, trade can increase, specialization can increase, productivity of labor can increase, and so on. And Malthus actually accepted that critique, and in the second edition of his Principle of Population, he changed his tune. But none of his followers today ever catch on to that. So, we go now to 2 things that I would love for you to watch online. One is called Demographic Winter, the Decline of the Human Family. And it's on YouTube, several different locations on YouTube. And the other is an interview by Jordan Peterson with, now I've forgotten who it is, but an expert in this field, The Terrifying Future for Humanity, Population Collapse. Kyle and I were talking just before we got started here this morning. The sort of majority opinion among population watch organizations is that global population will begin to decline somewhere around the year 2070, and the decline will accelerate after that. The reason for that is that it seems so far we haven't found any exceptions to this, that as a society gets wealthier and wealthier, people choose to have fewer and fewer children. Now, part of that is simply that the wealth diminishes the rate of infant and child mortality. So if you want to raise 3 or 4 kids, you don't have to have 6 or 8. You can have 3 or 4 and be pretty doggone sure you're going to raise 3 or 4. Not like Queen Anne of England back in the early 18th century, who had 19 children and not one of them survived to adulthood. She was arguably the richest woman in the world at the time. Riches didn't make any difference because we didn't have antibiotics or all sorts of other things. Now, people can have a few children and raise a few children. Another reason is that we prolong the period that children are dependents. In farm life, a child, in particularly fairly primitive farm life, a child is a productive laborer by age 5 or 6. In our time now, what is it? 30? 40? I don't know. Well, maybe the early 20s, something like that. But it's costly to raise children, which I think, by the way, is no great excuse for saying, oh, therefore I don't want to have any. I just, I look at what God says in Psalm 127, children are a punishment from the Lord, the fruit of the womb is his curse. Bitter and sad is the man who has his quiver full of them. No, that's not how it goes, is it? I would love for more and more Christians to just say, we'll just accept whatever children the Lord gives us, because I believe that the Lord is good and he intends good for us. Anyway, 2 good things to see online. Okay. 3 book recommendations: The War Against Population by Jacqueline Kaysen, The Economics and Ideology of World Population Control. That was one of the earliest exposés of the population control movement. That led later, in part, to Fatal Misconception by Matthew Connolly, The Struggle to Control World Population. Connolly was a Harvard historian who admired the population control movement, and he wanted to do a history of the movement that would show the goodness of all of this. Because he was such a scholar and because he was so friendly to the movement, he got access to the archives of the Rockefeller Foundation and the Zero Population Growth and all of these different organizations, and he got into the archives and he was horrified at what he saw were the driving motivations. It was all eugenics and racism. And he wound up writing this big, fat, very scholarly book exposing the whole thing. It's brilliant. I would love for many, many people to read this. It's so eye-opening. And then the other one is over here, Jonathan Last, What to Expect When No One's Expecting, America's Coming Demographic Disaster. Total fertility rate in America right now is down around about 1.6. That's 1.6 children for every woman through her lifetime. You can figure out real quickly that doesn't replace population. The only reason America's population has continued to grow over the last roughly 30 years, 25 years, is because of immigration. So, what is man? Is he only a consumer and polluter or a producer and steward? I've argued that we're producers and stewards. Resources aren't natural, they're man-made. Raw materials are what are natural. Genesis 1:28 says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. That's pro-population. Psalm 127 verses 3 through 5, which I misquoted before, you all know the passage. Then there's Proverbs 14:28. This is not just for families, it's for whole societies. In a multitude of people is a king's glory, but in the dearth of people is a prince's ruin. That ruin, by the way, is soon coming to China, which is being driven by its one-child policy, which it has finally lifted, but people are so accustomed to it now that it's not making much difference. It is going to begin a rapid demographic decline, probably has already begun it, but will certainly begin it within the next few years. Okay, now, are we running out of resources? I want to be very, very quick about this. I think I mentioned last week that for every resource that we extract from the earth, whether it is mineral, animal, or vegetable, the long-term price trend is downward, and since price is a measure of scarcity, what that means is that the abundance is upward. That means we're not running out of resources, we're getting more and more resources because resources are not natural, people make them. They transform raw materials into resources. Here I'll give you just a couple of examples. On the left, figure 1 is the composite price index in constant 1997 dollars for 5 metals and 7 industrial mineral commodities all joined together. You can see the long-term inflation-adjusted price of those is sharply downward from 1900 to 2000. That comes from the USGS, Geological Survey. On the right, the inflation-adjusted corn, wheat, and soybean prices, 1912 to 2018, this from the USDA. And there are ups and downs, and that's normal for pretty much everything, but you can see clearly the long-term trend for all of those. And I could go on and show you similar things for all the different crops and for livestock and so on. Here's a dramatic example. I showed you just now prices adjusted for inflation, but what's really crucial is prices adjusted for inflation and wages. Because if our wages are growing long-term faster than inflation, which has been the case with ups and downs, right, then the affordability of everything gets greater. Well, in the top half of that chart is the inflation-adjusted only price index for wheat from 1801 to 1990. In the bottom half, you have the prices adjusted or indexed by wages. Look what's happened. You are paying, as an equivalent of your income, less than 1% of what your ancestors 200 years ago paid for wheat. That's pretty amazing. But that's what happens because of human productivity. Years ago, there used to be a sign that you would see every once in a while as you drove across Kansas. One Kansas farmer feeds himself and 70 people. It's now something closer to about 200 people. It's just amazing. For those of you who have young children and you'd like them to begin to learn about things like this book, Hero for the Hungry, The Life and Work of Norman Borlaug, is just wonderful. It's written for children. Borlaug was the Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1970 for his work developing high-yield varieties of all sorts of different crops, mainly the staple crops of wheat and sorghum and corn and so on. And he's called the father of the Green Revolution. His work by itself caused about a quadrupling of average crop yield around the world within a period of just about 40 years. It was just amazing. That's why when Paul Ehrlich, in his book, The Population Bomb, published in 1968, said, no matter what we do in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will die of famine, he turned out absolutely wrong. The rate of famine-caused death in the world in the 1970s plummeted compared with any time in the past. It's because of the work of this sort of a man. Every year on March 25, his birthday, the Cornwall Alliance holds a day of prayer in his honor, thanking the Lord for his work and pointing to other work as well. Okay, real quickly, I'm going to go over some air pollution stuff here. This is from the EPA, air pollution in the United States, our nation's air, trends through 2020. Now, when you see trends through 2020, what do you think, how far back are we going to go? Trends through 2020. Well, it's really interesting that, in fact, the EPA doesn't make it easy to go very far back in its data. This is the main chart that it offers. Now, this is good news, declining national air pollutant emissions, and I'm not going to go into the individual ones, but pretty much everything declines over that period, some of it quite markedly, but that's over a period of 30 years, 1990 to 2020. Now, here is concentration averages. Emissions lead to concentration averages, right? Those too decline pretty significantly over the same period of time. But what was happening before 1990? Was everything going up? No. This is 1980 to 2015. This is also from data in the EPA, but they don't give you a chart. So I took their data and made the chart out of it. And this is the percentage change in air pollutant concentrations, 1980 to 2050. Everything is down, some of it by almost 100%. That's really significant because part of what it shows you is that from 1980 to 1990, there must have been some significant reduction. But then this goes 1970 to 1986. And this is the trends in the criteria air pollutants. And here we see that aside from, let's see, emissions of nitrous oxides, Everything else was down significantly from 70 to 86. Now, I didn't have time to go back to earlier data, but the fact is that according to the Statistical Abstract of the United States, air pollutant concentrations in the United States have been declining since the 1930s. That's amazing. It's very difficult to find that information at the EPA, which is part of why I gave you this booklet, Modus Operandi, because you need to understand how the government agencies twist the facts and hide the facts in order to keep you afraid. All right, a couple of reading recommendations here. One is Modus Operandi, which I've given you. The other is Scare Pollution, Why and How to Fix the EPA by my good friend Steve Malloy. This will make you furious to read because it reveals, in part, that the EPA does testing of the effect of air pollution on people in laboratories that, according to the EPA, should be killing people. It's violating the Nuremberg Code on medical experimentation. And by the way, it's not actually killing people. But it's doing this kind of testing and using that testing to drive its claims of very, very high danger from air pollution. The reality is, and I'm going to back up here. Well, no, wait a minute. Yeah, okay, here's where I want. We need to think in terms of long-term trends versus momentary measures. Also, we need to get rid of the whole notion of what's called linear no threshold theory as to toxicity. That's the idea that if a given substance could kill you at this level with, say, 80% odds, then at this level it's going to kill you with, say, 20% odds, and at this level at, say, 15%, but you never get to zero. Now that thinking would tell you that if you swallow an entire bottle of 500 aspirin tablets, it'll kill you. So if 500 people swallow one tablet each, they'll all die. That's insane. But that's linear no threshold theory in toxicity. And that's what is used officially by the EPA to tell us that we are in danger from, for example, PM 2.5, particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less in size. They're telling us that's dangerous. And then they are doing experiments with PM 2.5 in which they are subjecting people to levels of that are far beyond the level that they say is deadly. I'm sorry, I get a little upset about these things. All right, what's ahead? Next week is, July 7, when I come back again, we're going to be looking primarily at, or almost exclusively at climate change, climate and energy, policy related to that. And that'll be a little more detailed. I'll be bringing a good bit of stuff out of this book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism. 16 chapters, 16 different authors, 9 climate scientists and others. Great stuff. I've run right to 10:20, and so I think I have time for just a couple of quick questions.
I'll pass the microphone around so we can get your question on the recording too.
So I read this week in the Wall Street Journal that Russia is facing a significant population decline, and I assume that was part of the communist controls over years,
yeah.
But what other, I didn't expect to read that.
Okay,
I was wondering why.
Okay, first, Russia's population actually has been declining since the 1980s. And it only continued to grow until the 1980s because of what is called demographic inertia. The number of women of childbearing age was enough that the births offset the deaths of the much older people. But Russia's population has been declining for quite a while. It's declining increasingly rapidly. Now, in Russia, the reason for that is not the same as the reason in China. Russia never wanted people to have fewer children. It's that life was so awful in Russia that people just chose not to have children. China, by contrast, adopted a one-child policy, trying to get people to have fewer children, because, as the good secular humanist Marxist thinkers that they were, materialists, they thought of human beings as primarily consumers and polluters rather than producers and stewards, and they had a very high population that was growing rapidly at the time, and they thought that dooms us, so let's stop that. So they adopted that policy. Well, now their people are so accustomed to that they can't seem to turn it around. They're trying to reward people for having more children, and it's not working. Okay? So yeah, well, WSJ, I saw that article too, and yep, okay.
Yeah, a question about the EPA, but really just as a proxy for the rest of the agencies. But in terms of their motivation, you know, I imagine there's many scientists at the EPA that know that, you know, what they're publishing is false. So one motivation would be just to build the power and influence, and, you know, bureaucracies, you know, perpetuate themselves.
Yeah.
Are there any other, like, conflicts of interest and you know, financial gain and revolving doors, like we've seen, for instance, with some of the health agencies between them and the pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah. Well, actually, the pharmaceuticals are involved in this because, of course, they make birth control medications, and that gets them, you know, they benefit from the impression that population growth is a big problem. And so they're major funders of a lot of the research that gets done, whether it's by the EPA or anybody else. So that's part of it. Much of it is just simply the dominant liberal secularist worldview is anti-human. It just plain and simply is. And so if they think that the United States is overpopulated, which most of them do, then they think we need to get rid of some of us, or we need to quell our growth so that we don't stay overpopulated. Conservatives are happy to just live their lives and let you live your life as long as you don't, you know, use fraud, theft, or violence, right? Liberals tend to want to live their lives and control your life. All of this is related to that, and actually, of course, if we go way back to the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed by an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. Because if you can do that, people go to you to be their savior. You know, they figure if they can get us fearful enough, we will cling to them as savior. The wonderful thing is Jesus is our savior, and he doesn't have to cause us to fear in order to be that. He doesn't drive us to that by fears of catastrophe, other than hell, of course, right? Which is a pretty bad catastrophe, but okay, anything else? All right, well, thank you very much, and God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of the Lord's Day, and may the preaching of the Word change our hearts this morning.